The Supreme Court guts the Arizona immigration law. We're going to talk about it today on Faith and Freedom. I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Joining me is Harry Mahette, senior litigation counsel for Liberty Counsel. Harry, the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision ultimately gutted the Arizona law. We'll talk about some of the different provisions that it did involve. But essentially what it ultimately said was that a number of significant provisions were preempted by federal law. The Constitution specifically speaks about immigration, but when the federal government ultimately regulates a particular area, like it does the airwaves, the Federal Communications Commission, or the air passageways for airliners, the Federal Aviation Authority, when it engages in more of a comprehensive regulation of an area, it essentially preempts that area, and state or local laws to the contrary that interfere with those areas are not permissible. And essentially that's what the court said here. There's federal regulation that governs this, and some of the state provisions in the Arizona law conflicted with those provisions and therefore were unconstitutional. It did, however, send back a particular portion of the case. Didn't rule that it was constitutional, but that will ultimately be something that will continue in further litigation in the future. We'll talk about the specifics as we go today.
That's right, Matt. In order for preemption to take place, though, the federal government only has to legislate in a particular area. It doesn't have to enforce the laws that it puts into effect. And so in this case, Arizona has found out that even though the federal government chooses not to enforce the immigration laws that are in place, that it has passed, it cannot come in and do the federal government's job for it.
Yeah, and I think that's what ultimately happened is that Arizona was displeased with how the federal government was acting or not acting in this particular case. And so they came in to pass legislation to say, if you're not going to enforce the laws, we're going to do it ourselves. And that's kind of a symptom as opposed to what ultimately happened that caused this, but that doesn't change the preemption issue. What you ultimately need to do is go back to the federal government, and they need to do the job that they've ultimately legislated in the area as a requirement for them to do.
That's right. The Constitution does delineate specific things that are supposed to be done by the government, by the federal government, and some that are that belong upon the states. And the remedy here is to hold the federal government accountable for not enforcing its laws, rather than to try to encroach upon that authority.
Yeah. For an example, this is just a quick example in terms of how this might conflict. Say if the federal law in immigration says that if someone is here illegally, then the federal government has the right to deport them. But say if Arizona says if they find somebody that's here illegally, they have the right to put them in prison for 2 years. And now the federal government wants to deport this individual, but Arizona says, no, that person's under our jurisdiction serving time in prison for 2 years. You can't deport them until they finish their prison term for 2 years. You can see how the federal scheme would conflict with the state scheme. And if that happened on a 50-state scale, one state saying in prison for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, you would have this real difficult time to enforce this scheme that should be a national scheme, this national area of immigration. That's essentially what's happening in Arizona. I predicted that this is what the court would ultimately do, and that's what they did. Now, one of the things that they said was this. They said Section 3 imposed a misdemeanor on individuals for willful failure to complete or carry an alien registration document. So if you were found and you did not carry your alien registration document, you were fined, you were punished with a misdemeanor. That was struck down because it says it interferes with the federal law regarding alien registration. Congress already said what needs to happen with people in terms of their papers, how that is to be managed. Arizona said, we want to do it a different way. We want to impose a different kind of penalty. That conflicted with the federal law.
That's right. Congress has already legislated in that area and has legislated not only the requirements, but the consequences for failing to meet those requirements. Again, Congress is not enforcing those provisions, but that doesn't give Arizona the right to come in and come up with its parallel system.
And then Section 5 of the law imposed a misdemeanor for an illegal immigrant to knowingly apply for work, solicit work in a public place, or perform work as an employee or an independent contractor. Now, that conflicted with federal law because Congress has already legislated in that area, and they have chosen to enforce those provisions by focusing on the employer, not the employee. So Congress, the federal law, would fine an employer for knowingly employing someone who is here illegally. What Arizona did was they wanted to go focus on the employee, and that would interfere with Congress's application of the law as well. Then Section 6 provided that a state officer may arrest a person if the officer has probable cause to believe that the person has committed any public offense which makes him removable from the United States. This was struck down as preempted by the federal law because removability, deportation, is the duty of the federal government, not the state government. And then there's one provision that was upheld, but it wasn't ruled on as itself being constitutional. We can talk about that because that's the one provision that's still in effect, and that's the Section 2 of this law.
And that was the one provision that stirred up the most controversy in the early stages of this battle. That's the provision that requires Arizona law enforcement officials to check for immigration status documents and papers whenever they have probable cause, when they've stopped somebody lawfully for other violations.
Whether it's reckless driving or murder.
That's
They're
right.
suspected of doing one of the two. They have probable cause that they've committed a crime completely separate from being here legally or illegally.
That's right. The cops can't just go down the street and profile people and stop them just because they look a certain way or speak a certain way. They have to have probable cause for a lawful detention. And when that happens, they, under this Arizona law, can go the extra step and inquire into their immigration status and take appropriate action. Unfortunately, even though that particular aspect of the law has been upheld, now the Obama administration has come up and have said, we're not going to cooperate with those Arizona law enforcement officials, and we're not going to verify the status of the people that they stop on the streets.
Yeah, and so, you know, what ultimately happens here is this particular provision was enjoined or prevented from enforcement by the federal court. What the U.S. Supreme Court said is that it was premature to enjoin it, so they reversed the injunction. They did not say that this provision is constitutional or not. They did not rule on the actual provision itself. They just said that it's premature for a federal court to enjoin it. Why? Because the state courts first need the opportunity to be able to determine the breadth of that particular position. So it needs to now be litigated in a state court for the state court to determine how broad or how narrow is this. And then the court suggested if, in fact, there is no racial profiling, and if, in fact, it's only being used to check your status after you've already stopped somebody for probable cause for committing another crime, and just like you're checking for your license, driver's license, you also check, are you here legally? If you do it that way, then it's fine. But if you start racially profiling or you stop somebody because you think they're not here legally but you don't have probable cause for some other crime, that's going to be unconstitutional. So the resolution of this is still up in the air. The problem that you ultimately have is here you go again, because President Obama, when this particular provision was sent back down, said through the administration, when police stop someone, even if they have probable cause that they've committed another crime and they want to call and have a check, is this person here legally or not, the federal government's not going to tell the state officers. That makes no sense.
No, it's adding insult to injury, because now you've got the federal government making a willful decision not to enforce the law of the land and affirmatively interfering with states who choose to do that. I mean, you have to have some sympathy for Arizona. As a border state, this is a real problem that they've tried to resolve. And the Obama administration is just making it impossible to do that.
Well, it's a very significant issue that we need to have bipartisan cooperation on. We are a nation of immigrants, and we need to remember that.
That's right.
And we also, in fact, Harry is an immigrant from Romania who's now a United States citizen. So we are a nation of immigrants. That's our history, and we need to remember that and have open arms and not close our borders. On the other hand, we need to make sure that the immigration laws are in effect, that we do have secure borders, and that they are enforced. All of that requires a significant bipartisan balancing act, which we don't really have with the current Congress. We need some changes this coming November to make sure that we have individuals who will work together and who will address this and many other issues that face America. For more information, go to Liberty Counsel's website, lc.org, and ask for the Patriot's Handbook on American Liberty.